I was very heartened to hear Jim say that the difference between Earth, system, science, and Gaia was poetry. Yeah. Because it is our linguistic equivalent of a living system. It's something that is able to sustain so many complex connections across disciplines, across time. It has these wonderful things called metaphors and metonyms that allow these connections to take place. Jim's a practitioner, somebody who makes things, and so I think I'm going to talk to you because following Sander and Amanda, so many wonderful ideas are already in the air. I'm just going to talk to you about the composition of one particular poem, which I think, in retrospect, having spent a couple of days here, was influenced by a Gaian way of thinking. Back in 2017, I was commissioned to write a poem about the Humber Estuary. Big thing to write about. How do you write about such a complex ecosystem? I met a man who was an expert on aquatic worms, and he told me that the Humber mud was held together by this tiny, tiny worm called the harbour ragworm, or Nereis diversicola, and that over the past 300 or 400 million years, this worm had evolved a very complex chemical communication system in order to find its mate in another discrete hidden burrow. They have extraordinary sex lives, aquatic worms, of which I'll tell you a little bit more in a minute. So in order to smell each other, they secrete these chemicals. But with the change in the pH, which has been above 8 for a very long period of time, to below 8, which is what they're predicting over the next 80 or so years, if nothing changes, these worms will be rendered chemically blind. Now, as a poet, when you're given something like that, you think, goodness, how do I take that piece of information and make it as vivid as possible to as many people as possible? Surely I need to find some analogies between that and the human system of communication. So the poem that I'm going to read to you, one poem, it's in 7 or 8 sections, it probably lasts about 7 or 8 minutes, tries to find lots of relationships between us as a species that communicates linguistically and these worms that communicate using chemical signals. Now, of course, the Humber Estuary is a place of migrations, both of human life, of bird life. It is also, as you'll see from this picture up here, we can't quite see it, but that is cooling tower vapor from a very large oil refinery at Salt End. So you've got these tiny little worms that are going to be impacted by the carbon that's being released by the oil refinery that's right next to the mud. So it's that movement, which I think poetry can achieve, between the tiny, tiny worm and our petroculture that I wanted to explore. Now, I think poetry is a sort of global climate with very local weather and very local features. So just sit back. As with any journey through something, there are some things you may enjoy, and there are other things that may just completely baffle you. Just let it go over your head. And I shall just read to you I've got exactly the right amount of time to read it. Okay, so lots of Hull references which may pass you by, but here we go. Spurn Point is a shingle spit at the mouth of the Humber Estuary. Above 8, Spurn flows through its shape like breath on glass, flaring and fading, waves at an angle, heard as a motorway becoming waves. Pebbles, plastics, shell and bone hissed up the beach. On the Humber side, behind the grey dunes hush, curlews furrow a mirror's ebb as the channel drains light from white oaks of cooling tower vapour reflected in Kilnsey clays. Without beginning, everywhere, Humber's great motet swirls its many voices. Mud brains sculled in clear water beneath the jetty travel in the confluence of moon and sun as gametes mature to genital crisis. A ravel of clothes, gleam of flask lid. Under their coats, the lovers go still, where the current flows fastest, shaking with laughter, vastly exposed to ferries and the tankers in Grimsby roads. Those white splats on the beach, as if a flock of herring gulls had taken off, lugworm sperm. As the tide washes over the sand, the sea's higher pH activates the sperm, which the female smells and pumps down into her burrows, bathing her eggs. This happens on 2 days in winter each year. There are 4 minutes to achieve fertilization. If the sea's pH drops below 8, the love songs of the worms over millions of years are silenced. The green-gold explosions of plover at Reed's Island, an immeasurable blank. Driven sand snakes white across the beach, saltation inducing static electricity, twice the predicted volume lifted to pepper a crash helmet, the sloughed casing of an organism whose luminous scribbles of fishing line incubate chemicals in the sea's gut. Last light lengthens its elliptical shadow into night. Look back at the dunes with a head torch on, and all you see are eyes bouncing around, blinking. It's mad out there, digging for bait in the dark. High tide, frost stillness. The stars are still there. We have placed a light under a green cone to guide us past the restlessness of stony binks. Paul, which is a place, from pegol, a peg or stake to mark a place of passage, moor a ferry, or gaze away an hour over water. Who will ferry me to woods crouched in time on the far bank, to peoples and fires, voices migrating through reeds to the steel guts of Salt End, a place apart, fluent in the language of our endings. What I remember is rain crackling on the car roof, a cold east wind, steam from the flask on the windscreen, the shapes of rain staggering into runs across refinery flares. Black-headed gulls cry windswept across the playing field. Ocean and ice, implied in its form. A sealskin vellum stitched together and stretched. Go, little kayak, into the silence of Garrison Ditch, where your maker drowned. Ukaluk and Memiadluk expressed joy at seeing this work of their people. Bring me the north on a whale's tooth, in a sealskin bag, knives worn by bone and ice. Sometimes I think this corner of Europe is all one world, and I heard a voice from elsewhere as the voice of many waters, klaxons and blue lights by the lock gates, as the Samskip innovator, aligned by GPS and directional thrust, slides in, containers, cylinders, cold store units, buzzing past with a meter's clearance. What offerings we have made for the crossing. The occupants of the votive boat gaze at us, their quartz eyes spilt by a glacier, chosen in a moment from this coast to stare through storms, the drainage of Car and Mere, mud and this museum case. No more precious stones in the world than these blizzard suns singing now. We are you. You too might have made us, facing these waters. Dead pebbles shine in the carved yew heads. The figures stood in an otter-headed boat of this estuary. The harbour ragworm's mucus burrows, weaves the humber's mud in place. It spins a mucus net. It spins a mucus net to catch its food, farms bacteria, and only eats them as a last resort. Its gut fauna is unexplored as rainforest soil. Shrimp are just crazy for its molecules. It takes up endocrine disruptors, the pill, steroids, us. This city would be all at sea without them. In turbid nurseries, juvenile flatfish rise to mid-water during flood tide, sink on the ebb. Here, the flatfish eye and jaw migrate, synapses sparking in the humber's brain. And from before the biting world, the lamprey twists and bores, the stone liquor in us strangely, pulling its body through streams and ditches into the glistening places, synaptic transmission studied through its nerves. We bore and suck, arrive at Far Ing's reserve through webs of fossil fuel and sat-nav, this syntax implicated in the empty tanker. Who would get here otherwise to see this ship glide under the bridge, its hollowness abounding? Thank you very much for listening, and thank you for inviting me.